Okay, we're live. Hi to anyone who's watching. Uh, this is a discussion with special guest Shaukat Ansari. Shaukat is he's just completed his PhD, or you have completed your PhD a while ago actually, at the University of Toronto in economics, and he specializes in South African economics. Shaukat, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being on. Would you mind giving our viewers an idea of who you are and what your field of specialty is, please?
Sure. So I completed my PhD at the University of Political Economy and International Development. And I was looking particularly at post-apartheid South Africa as a case study to understand, the politics of redistribution. And mainly I wanted to explore why South Africa actually hasn't been able to adopt policies that have led to, industrialization, diversification in the economy, higher rates of employment, specifically since that's what the ANC ran their platform on in the 1994 election. So I essentially look at, the impact of business and also the global capital markets and constraining South Africa's autonomy when it comes to economic policy making. And so my dissertation interviewed officials in the Treasury, the Department of Trade and Industry, and also labor and business leaders to try to further unpack the dynamics behind the ANC's economic and political policies.
Okay. Well, that's a pretty excellent summary. What was it that interested you in South Africa in the first place, since you live in Canada?
Yeah, I just thought the history was fascinating. So I've always been interested in, a little heterodox economic theories, and I'd read a lot about those theories as they were applied to South Africa when I was an undergrad. And so I never visited the country. I also wanted to visit, so it was a reason to visit. And I have now twice, for field work. So that's why I got interested in it, and I decided to make it a project.
Okay, that's awesome. So when you say that there were case studies in your undergrad, you said when we met, you told me that South Africa has a very unique and interesting, economic history the last 24 years since it got launched into a global capitalist system after being sanctioned and isolated from the world. So is that why they made case studies out of it?
Yeah, so the case studies actually even go back to the period of apartheid. So there was a debate in the economics literature between basically Marxists, or more radical economists, critical economists, and liberal economists. And the liberal economists were arguing that apartheid was a distortion of the market. It was not rational from the point of view of capitalists, and that the only reason it survived for so long is because white workers wanted to keep certain privileges in place because they enjoyed better access to managerial positions and better access to services under that type of policy. And so the liberal economists advocated for the end of apartheid, saying that it would actually, stimulate more growth. The Marxist economists, or the heterodox economists at that time, were arguing that apartheid and segregation was in fact a very rational capitalist accumulation strategy, specifically because it allowed companies to export gold. And since at the time the price of gold was fixed, by state central banks and by the world economy, the only way to minimize costs was to have this abundant supply of cheap black labor, which they could continuously push down the wages and costs based on things like the color bar, and by barring access to higher positions in managerial jobs. And so I was always more convinced by that heterodox explanation of apartheid, and so I wanted to understand then further what would happen once the system was abolished, if what the liberals said would actually materialize. And if you look at the 20 years since, it really hasn't in terms of economic growth.
That's pretty fascinating, because you could probably draw some parallels with American slavery, and
Yes.
with slavery. The idea that you have this sort of captive labor force, and then once slavery was abolished, lo and behold, the market forces were arguably as oppressive, if not more. You know, just the fact that people had the opportunity, in theory, to pursue something else doesn't mean that it materialized in real life, right?
Yeah, no, that's definitely absolutely correct. And there's also the issue of what would actually happen to that labor once those systems were actually abolished and lifted. And one thing I point to is that in the absence of directed state intervention in the labor market, it's not as if that labor will suddenly find employment or will automatically have their standard of living lifted up, right? So it's actually just getting rid of the system
Right.
when that system was actually for the benefit of certain capitalist sectors will not actually lead to a change in living standards without intervention by the state. So that's actually one portion of my my work that I look at.
Oh, really? That's really interesting. So let's get back to like the basics here, because we're talking about Marxism versus free market capitalism, and we're talking about concepts that people don't necessarily understand. Like, I don't necessarily have the best understanding of it. I think I understand what these things mean. But then, like, let's go back to the definitions. So, you know, what South Africa currently has, if I'm not mistaken, is a sort of semi-socialist, but mostly free market capitalist system. In other words, we have a handful of parastatals that are partially owned by the state, but the rest of the economy is decidedly private, and it's very, very business friendly, very capitalist. That's my understanding of where South Africa is today. And I see very often from right wingers and from your more sort of libertarian centrists this argument that the ANC is so Marxist and so communist in their economics, which is, I mean, it's patently untrue. Even someone like me can see that. And I think it's just a talking point that they spew out to try and demonize, the government. But like, what's your take on that? Like, how capitalist is South Africa compared to, say, Canada? And are we friendly to business? What's your assessment?
Yeah, it's fully capitalist, even compared to a country like Canada. In fact, Canada likely has more state intervention in the economy at this point, and more crown corporations, and more expansive fiscal policy. The ANC is Marxist or radical in rhetoric only at this point. And regarding the state-owned companies, the reason why you didn't have full privatization even in 1994, 1996 is simply because COSATU, the largest labor federation, the South African Communist Party at the time, mobilized massive protests against the full privatization of parastatals like Eskom and Transnet. Otherwise, they likely would have gone ahead and privatized the entire slew of state-owned corporations. So that's actually one victory that popular protest achieved at the time by making sure that at least those companies remained in remain public corporations. But aside from that, every capitalist economy has some public intervention in the economy. So that alone can't be the yardstick to determine whether a country is socialist, capitalist. So the ANC is very business friendly at this point, and it's fully capitalist.
Okay.
South Africa, yeah.
Wow. You see, the thing from where I'm standing, and my understanding of this is that the ANC has to have socialist rhetoric. They have to promise things to South Africa's poor majority in order to stay in power and keep the peace. But the truth is that whether they like it or not, they're already beholden to large businesses, private corporations, and all of this kind of can be traced back to the 90s after apartheid ended and we had our first democratic election, when our leaders decided to sit down and make a deal with the various economic stakeholders of South Africa. So people who were like large mining magnates, or I don't know, large landowners, or anyone who was making money from our system, from our economy, anyone at the top. And they were pushing for this very, very capitalist approach. And the ANC caved for a number of reasons. So I don't know if you've seen that interview with Ronnie Casserol's where he talks about this.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think you can probably go into a little more detail about that, because I know that is what happened, but I don't know the details of why politically, like how it actually unfolded at that moment in time. So maybe you could give us a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of literature and scholarship on exactly how business courted the ANC during that period. One scholar, Saint-Pierre Terreblanche, he's written a large study documenting the fact that at the time that the political constitutional negotiations, formal negotiations were taking place between the ANC and the National Party. There were parallel informal negotiations taking place between the ANC and large conglomerate corporations which were sponsored by Anglo-American and the South Africa, at the time, the South Africa Foundation, the business association that represented all the multinational corporations, mainly in the country. And in those informal negotiations, business, we don't know too much about exactly what was said clearly because they were informal, but the ANC essentially was wined and dined. It was argued by the business community. A number of planning scenarios and economic modeling scenarios were sponsored by the South Africa Foundation, by Anglo-American, in which they were trying to debunk populism and the principles outlined in the Reconstruction and Development Program, the first Keynesian document put out by the ANC. And essentially business convinced the ANC that in order to generate or to encourage private investment and encourage trade and to lower the unemployment rate, it was necessary to create a very hospitable environment for business. And the argument that business put forward was that liberalization had to go forward. A number of regulations, capital controls, trade tariffs had to be removed and lifted. Taxes had to be kept low. Fiscal expansion had to be kept to a minimum. Right, inflation had to be kept low. All of these factors. And there's actually now, though, pretty much a consensus in the scholarship that what business was really interested in at that point was they wanted to expand their operations beyond South Africa's borders, because investment opportunities and especially gold production had dried up due to sanctions and due to the state of the world economy. And to maintain a certain profit, they had to expand operations outside of South Africa, and they could only do that if the ANC lifted all of the restrictions and regulations that had been put in place by the apartheid government. So that was the real goal at the time. But also there's the fact that the business community in South Africa is quite unique compared to the rest of the continent, because it's extremely large in relation to the state. Whereas in other African countries, it's the state sector that tends to draw for is larger than the private business sector. So simply by virtue of that, structural power or that veto that business could hold over any incoming government, they were able to, convince the ANC not to pursue too radical of an approach.
Well, if that was the case then, surely it's more so the case than ever, because private industry has grown exponentially in wealth, and those people who were moneyed before a democracy have grown exponentially in wealth. So is it also your, opinion that our government is more captured than ever by private business?
Yes, absolutely. And there's another dynamic at work too now that wasn't at work in 1994 during apartheid, which is that when the ANC lifted all capital controls on non-resident South Africans, it meant that businesses, foreign corporations could essentially, transfer funds into the country and then out of the country on a whim, or based on their own calculations of where the best profit was to be made, or based on political calculations or based on, any type of dissatisfaction with the political climate. And so South Africa, or the ANC especially, is now dependent to a large extent on foreign portfolio capital to fund the fiscal deficit, fund the current account deficit. One thing we often hear is that South Africa is progressive or is moving towards more of a socialist stance because of the cash transfer payments, which go to 16 million South African residents now. But what people forget is that most of that funding is paid for through borrowing on foreign capital markets. And so it keeps South Africa enmeshed in this global capitalist system. And it gives basically foreign asset holders a veto over heterodox economic policies.
Right.
So there's also that, yeah.
It's almost like an addictive cycle, right? Once you take out, a loan or foreign investment, then, it has an immediate effect that helps the economy grow. But because all of that new wealth is going to the top, as always does in capitalist societies, then you're left with a large class of people who can't afford to purchase things, which then slows the economy again. And so it's kind of like a vicious cycle. Like we increase the number of poor people. We run into all of these typical problems that are inherent in capitalism. And because there is no Keynesian plan to help counteract that, or any sort of like socialist development policy to help counteract it, we just going further and further down this path of neoliberal capitalism. Is that more or less what's happening?
Yes, and I should also mention not all foreign investment is equal. So the ANC had predicted, based on what business had said at the time, is that liberalization would actually bring in foreign direct investment. And if that had actually transpired, it would have been useful, because foreign direct investment actually is involved in the construction of new plant, new capacity, new equipment, technological upgrades. It actually lowers the unemployment rate because you have now more factories or more industries operating. And it increases economic growth. But what in fact happened was that foreign investment in South Africa now is predominantly portfolio investment, which means very short-term investment in stocks and the equity markets to try to make a quick profit and turnover. And so that's how what most of the foreign capital flowing into South Africa is directed towards. It allows the state and corporations to borrow cheaply on world capital markets and speculate by investing in equities, or it allows the ANC to fund their deficit by raising debt on the capital markets, but it doesn't actually increase employment by investing in new plant and new equipment. So if you compare it to South Korea or even China or some of these successful capitalist stories, when people point to foreign direct investment, it's because in those situations or contexts you actually had good, useful foreign direct investment, which isn't the case in South Africa.
And why is that? Why is it that we have these sort of like short-term speculative loans as opposed to foreign direct investment? Like, what exactly is the political reason for that?
Right. So the reason is that something that development economists know now, based on studies of many other cases, is that capital is generally very risk averse, and if they're going to sink large amounts of money, into new plant and new capacity, and if they're going to train workers, they want to be guaranteed that they'll make a profit in the long run. And the only way they can be guaranteed that is if certain infrastructure is in place, if there's proper training and education of the workers, if they can guarantee transportation, etc. And the only way they can be guaranteed that is if the state intervenes adequately in the economy and enters into public-private partnerships and actually develops infrastructure and enhances training and education for the workforce. It's referred to in economic circles as crowding in investment, right? And that's what South Korea did. That's what Singapore did. That's what China continues to do. Although the labor market in China is quite different, but still, the Chinese state plays quite an active role in regulating the economy. And when you do that, you actually, encourage investment to take place in actual plant capacity and the hiring of workers. Whereas if you don't have that situation, generally, foreign capital or capital in general won't have much of an incentive to invest in infrastructure or in large capital projects, where they're not guaranteed that they'll get the return later down the road. So conservative or right-wing economists, right, who talk about the problems of state spending don't usually neglect the fact that historically foreign direct investment or successful capital stories have always transpired because of state intervention in infrastructure and spending or in training of the workforce or in any kind of spending that crowds in private investment.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it really is a vicious cycle. And if you look at a country that is like a social democracy, like Canada or France or any of the successful sort of Western European countries, right? They already have large state-sponsored infrastructure dating from like the mid-20th century. They have subways, they have public school for everyone, they have free university. You guys have like all of these social programs that are designed to support the economy, to support individuals in getting from A to B, making sure that they have food, that they have housing, that all their needs are met, in order for them to be able to be productive citizens, right?
Right.
Right, and that costs money, but it's worth it. It's an investment in your people. And so I like the whole point of your dissertation is that like because of the failure to do that in this country, which people incorrectly like the failure to do that is what is materialized in this terrible inequality that we have today. I think we're the #1 most unequal country in the world. And it's just funny to me that right-wingers will complain and complain about like, we need further privatization or we need like, and it's like, the country is on life support because of privatization and because of business-friendly policies. So it's just funny to me that it's the exact opposite of everything they're saying. But here's a question, amidst all of that, right? Often when I try to argue with people and say, look, we need to do social programs, we need to do housing, like free medical care, all of that stuff, then they'll say, but we can't afford it. And I'm like, we can't afford not to do it. And my question to you is, like countries like Norway and France and all of these countries that right-wingers like to exemplify as like, oh, these are, good countries, they're prosperous, whatever. Is it like what came first, like the chicken or the egg? It's like, did they design these programs first, or did they wait until they had money from capitalism and then put them in place? Like,
yeah, I mean, there's a number of different ways those states have acquired the financing to do that. In South Africa's case, I can say, I believe you were having a debate you had recently with, I think, Ronaldo was his name. You talked about raising taxes by 1%, quoting this guy, Adam Habib, who has written about this issue, right? And the argument from conservative economists is that this will cause business to, shift operations abroad or not invest, or, people to move abroad because of the higher taxes. But I can just say, first of all, historically, that's not the case. But I can also say South Africa actually doesn't even need to raise taxes, because South Africa, initially at least, because like many other developing countries, has amassed massive foreign exchange reserves after the East Asian crisis as an insurance against possible defaults by South African companies. In 2018, the amount of foreign reserves held by the Reserve Bank was about over 40 billion US dollars. And a number of economists like Danny Roderick at Harvard, who have spoken in South Africa to government officials, has pointed out that those foreign exchange reserves, which just sit in the central bank, right, sit in the coffers and are invested in US Treasury securities, that represents an opportunity cost of about 1% of gross domestic product. So all South Africa really has to do is start using those exchange reserves to actually, spend on developing infrastructure, upgrading technological skills, upgrading education, investing in healthcare, all these things with the money that's already there sitting in the Reserve Bank, without actually raising taxes one bit initially. And the critics would argue that this then, sends a signal to investors that there's no insurance against bad loans. But, as Patrick Bond has argued, a number of developing countries have found a way around that by imposing capital controls on outflows, meaning that it's called locking capital in. But when you lock capital in that fashion, then capital can't, escape or move to other areas in the short term. And the spending by the foreign exchange reserves on infrastructure, on upgrades, on importing crucial technological inputs would then crowd in that investment that's forced to stay in the country. And that's again how many developing countries were able to initially develop. So initially it wouldn't require raising taxes at all. It would just require spending this money, that's sitting in the Reserve Bank, that's actually just gathering interest and not being used, right?
I mean, that's pretty unbelievable. I don't know if it was you who told me this, because I remember someone told me that, like, we have all this money in the Reserve Bank. And I didn't even think it was true anymore, because our country acts like it's broke. Like, we act like we can't afford to do housing for people. I mean, there's so many people who are homeless in South Africa. But I find it incredibly shocking. And once again, like, I have to ask you, why is our government that captured by private business and investors that they would rather have that insurance than spend a little bit of it and build the necessary infrastructure to meet people's basic human rights?
Right. So, I mean, I should point out that it's not the entire government. So, in my interviews with officials, the departments like the Department of Trade and Industry and the Economic Development Department have generally lobbied for a more progressive and heterodox economic approach, such as using some of those exchange reserves, using capital controls on inflows and outflows to regulate hot money or short-term investment. And one official in the DTI had said he had tried to get the Treasury to impose taxes or export taxes on the export of raw materials, primary commodities, in order to encourage value-added production, or to try to encourage the use of those raw materials for domestic production rather than simply exporting them abroad, which would increase more strategic industries and raise employment in the long term. The problem is the Treasury. There's no a main impediment to this is there's no centralized economic planning ministry in South Africa, meaning that despite what the mandate of the ANC is, different bureaucratic centers have different interests, and they debate over the appropriate economic policies to achieve those long-term goals. And the Treasury and the Reserve Bank are very beholden to investors, right? When I spoke to officials in the DTI, they said they're just very afraid of unorthodoxy because they don't want to upset investors. And it makes sense because the Treasury is charged with collecting revenue, with setting the budget, with raising debt if the revenue falls short of the projected budget for a given year. And so they don't want to upset investors or the credit rating agencies, which might raise the interest rates on long-term debt. So they tend to take a very short-term position. And as a result, they end up winning out against other departments whenever there's a debate with the office of the presidency. And one way around that, I argue, is to just create a centralized planning ministry so that you don't have debate, or you don't have this fracturing between different government departments, and to have a very clear agenda in terms of what steps need to be taken to promote or stimulate development. But the foreign exchange reserves, in combination with controls on capital outflows by business, would really stimulate more investment. And it's not as if business doesn't have the funds. When people talk about taxes, they take the money and they shift it to OECD countries in Europe or to other African countries especially, and invest it there to make larger profits. But if you actually lock down capital, as Patrick Bond once called advocates, and you start spending those foreign exchange reserves, then you could actually really alleviate the unemployment problem, inequality, and poverty, and while raising South Africa's economic performance.
Okay, I'm surprised how much we're getting through, like how much material we're getting through in a short amount of time.
Yeah, that's great.
Shaukat, I want to ask you about something a little bit different now. The land issue. Like, in my opinion, South Africa has vast areas of unused land in our rural areas. A lot of it is arid. We have a massive housing problem in our inner cities, where we have people being evicted from their homes in CBDs for private investors or land barons to come in there and utilize those buildings for profit. We have a problem with land with regards to food production, with regards to all kinds of things. And what we're facing at the moment as a country is that we have millions of people who are landless, who are not secure, who feel like they could be uprooted at any moment because they'll be living on a farm. And the person who owns the farm, if they sell that farm, then the people living there who are working on the farm could get retrenched and told you have to leave. We have a situation here that is basically feudal, with white farmers in particular, having so much power over their black workers and exploiting them. You know, there's no accountability for what farmers do in rural areas where they're 10 kilometers away from a police station. And what, you know, this is a situation in rural areas, and these people don't have the opportunity to utilize that land. They don't have security to know that they're going to be there next year or the year after, and they also don't have the ability to farm there or to do any kind of constructive operation there that would contribute to the economy, because they just don't have land security. It's my opinion that if we redistributed this unused land, which there's tracts and tracts of unused land, to the ordinary South Africans, that it would bolster our economy considerably, and that people would be able to participate in the economy in a meaningful way. Like, surely that's just logical.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we have historical evidence that every single developing country that was able to industrialize had some form of land reform, the program that they implemented. And South Africa's attempts at implementing land reform is, you know, very non-radical. I mean, if you look at other countries like South Korea, first where the landowning class was completely wiped out, and then, you know, heads of corporations were thrown in jail by the Syngman Rhee, who was the autocrat at that time, if they didn't go along with certain development projects. You know, those type of land reforms were far more, you know, draconian. And these are capitalist states, or China, or any of those East Asian countries. And where land reform has not taken place, like in many Latin American countries, economic growth has stagnated, because we know agricultural reform is one of the primary engines for, you know, growth, simply because it creates an internal market when you distribute land and create a market for, you know, capital inputs from the manufacturing sector, and then you raise the incomes of, you know, landless laborers who suddenly are able to purchase goods in the domestic economy, and then you increase productivity in agriculture with more investment, because you don't have large landowners simply living off rents, right? You have land, you have now a number of different farmers who have to actually compete on the markets, and so they have to upgrade technologically to increase productivity. And again, even in the Western countries, there's something similar: the right of eminent domain. It gives the state the right to seize land that, for state development purposes, even if you have somebody who's not willing to sell. So it's not a radical approach by any means, and it's not communist. It's just you know, a very reasonable, I think, approach that South Africa's taking.
But I feel like most of the people who I have these arguments with will just bring out this word communist. Like, they'll just put it there and be like, there, I said communist, and now I've won the argument. It's like, first of all, you're wrong, and secondly, like, communism is not in and of itself a bad idea. That's subjective, right? Like, right. There's so many different kinds of communism, different kinds of socialism. You know, it's different in every country historically. So I find it blows my mind that people say that the ANC is radical, or that the government is radical, and that land reform can never work. Mm-hmm. They always point to Zimbabwe. It's actually getting really tired for me now. Mm-hmm. But I mean, if you could share some of those, some examples or case studies of, like you say, South Korea. I'm sure that there's some South American countries as well that are good examples of how land reform can work in a positive way.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at Chile, for example, where under Allende, the left government, before it was overthrown in a coup, he had nationalized some mining industries and implemented some land reform. And economists now say that, you know, much of the golden age of Chile, which right-wing economists give credit to Pinochet for, who implemented market orthodox programs, rolled back certain social reforms. It was largely due to the initial land reforms that had already existed in Chile, and the fact that certain mining companies had been nationalized, and that created a massive revenue and surplus for the state, which they could then continue to use to invest in other developmental projects, right? I think when people throw out communism, they're thinking mainly of Stalinism. And again, if you compare what Stalin did to South Africa's reform, I mean, Stalin collectivized agriculture. He had quotas in place. He essentially expropriated all the surplus that was being produced by the peasantry to sell on world markets to generate revenue for industrial programs. And when he had resistance from wealthy, you know, peasant classes, he essentially sent the Russian army to liquidate them, right, execute them. Honestly, South Africa is not doing anything anywhere near that. So I mean, the comparison to actual, like, I wouldn't call it communism, but it was state-sanctioned, type of communism. I mean, the comparison to that kind of communism doesn't come anywhere close in terms of what South Africa is attempting to do, right? Unfortunately, with Latin America, most of the land reforms that were attempted took place during the height of the Cold War. And so we don't really know exactly what would have taken place, because whenever a government came in to try to implement them, they were, usually overthrown quickly by the military, as in Guatemala or Nicaragua or in Chile. But clearly, if you look at the East Asian states where there was land reform, and you had a legacy of Japanese colonialism, which was actually based on very progressive agricultural policies, at least, you see that those are the countries that were able to develop the fastest and catch up with the West. And then you have late industrializing Western countries like Germany as well. And the Soviet Union's policy, I mean, it was successful in generating economic growth and industrialization, regardless of what you think of the tactics and the human rights abuses. But it doesn't, the Soviet example certainly doesn't show that, land reform in any kind of a sense is, has negative repercussions for economic growth. I mean, that's not what the record shows at all in any country where it's been attempted.
Fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I don't know how to get this across to people, but I mean, you explain it really well. Let's move on to something else. I saw an interview with Julius Malema recently, where the EFF's policy is to nationalize all national assets. So to nationalize the mines, to nationalize land, to do all these kind of things. And I think the critique that he gets about that, or the criticism that the EFF gets about that kind of policy, is once again that it's Stalinism, that it's a big bad communism, etc. And yet, he pointed out that China has done that. China has nationalized all their land and all their assets, and they kind of lease out whatever's needed for things to function well.
Right.
Do you think that is a viable economic model for South Africa?
So I'm not against nationalization, obviously. I think it has to be done strategically. And with Malema, I mean, I think the EFF is a good political party. It might represent the only, real hope, or at least the threat of election represents the only way to get South Africa, the ANC, to implement different policies. I don't know how much of that is rhetoric from Malema, and I think nationalization works if done properly with strategic industries. With China, it's a very different labor market, and it's very different, a very different bureaucracy. The Chinese state is extremely efficient because of going back to the revolution, the capacity they had to build up, the type of discipline they can exert right over foreign corporations and over their own population. But the labor market isn't something that South Africa should want to emulate. Again, it's based on very low wages, exploitation level wages and working hours, and the state can use a lot of repression to actually compel landless laborers or rural laborers to actually work for very low wages in foreign corporations. And that's why there's continuous investment, foreign direct investment in China, because of those low wage labor costs. I don't think that's sustainable in the long run. I don't think South Africa should emulate that, but that's one reason why nationalization has worked in that particular context, and why you don't actually have much of a protest from foreign corporations or the business class in China. In South Africa, I don't think the state is strong enough or efficient enough at this point yet to be able to implement something like that's that far-reaching in terms of nationalization. I think strategic nationalization is important. Even just one mine would be like in Chile, generates massive revenue for the state, and it also, when you nationalize certain companies, it has spillover effects into the rest of the economy. So again, the state can actually incur the costs and the risks of investing in new technologies within the state-owned company, and then the spillover effects to private corporations can be immense, and that can lead to higher rates of employment. So, South Korea did something similar when they created the first steel-owned company in the 1980s. It was very much protested by the World Bank and by foreign investors, saying it would be inefficient, etc. And it went on to become, at one point, the second most efficient and largest steel company in the world, and it was national, it was state-owned. And even in South Africa, you look at the arguments that nationalization is not efficient or public corporations are not efficient. We've seen the opposite. ISCOR was a state-owned steel company, right, under apartheid, that had been created by the apartheid government. One of the first acts of the ANC was to actually privatize ISCOR under the argument, on the based on the argument that it would be more efficient as a private held company. That didn't transpire at all. It was far more efficient and more profitable as a public corporation than it was after it became privatized. There were layoffs, there was a fall in profit, there was a fall in private investment. So clearly, public corporations and nationalization is useful. At this point, I would not advocate nationalizing every single company because I don't believe the capacity of the South African state is strong enough to be able to manage that efficiently. And there's other policies that can be used that would be less upsetting or would be less controversial in terms of the reaction from foreign investors that would be even perhaps more efficient in terms of generating economic growth.
Okay. What I want to ask you is that with but it escaped me, I'm not gonna lie. With regards to nationalization, I don't know if it also has to do with maybe our country is like quite sparsely populated. What I wanted to, which is different from China, obviously. Why is it that, like, what is a good reason for South Africa not to fear like the authoritarian potential of a government that takes over entities? Like, do you think that, because in my opinion, our government is incredibly liberal socially on social issues, and we have a rather strong and robust democracy, because there is that whole argument that the reason why Stalinism came about is because the state had this absolute power over these assets, over the people. Are there countries where the state does own the land and does have control over all of these things that hasn't transpired in like rampant authoritarianism and dictatorship? Or is that something that always needs to be mitigated and monitored, and keeping a close eye on the state and keeping the checks and balances in place?
I don't think it's inevitable that if the state expands ownership or control over certain resources or goods or companies, inevitably that'll lead towards dictatorship. I mean, you have one example again in Chile with Allende. One thing he did was nationalize a number of different corporations and implement a massive land reform, but he continued as a political democracy. In fact, he was criticized, the government was criticized massively by Fidel Castro at the time, saying that if he didn't impose more of an authoritarian hold on the Chilean economy and the population, it would end in a military coup by the military. And that's actually what happened, but it's not something Allende himself ever actually took seriously. He continued with political democracy, and he didn't liquidate the legislature or any of the democratic practices. He was just implementing economic reform. In the Cold War context, you can argue whether that was prudent of him, but clearly it doesn't follow that if you nationalize resources and certain goods, that means you're inevitably leading towards authoritarianism, right? It does exist in certain places, but yeah, it's a logical fallacy to say that it's a necessary condition, right? Or it's a sufficient condition for autocracy to emerge. And South Africa is very different from the Soviet Union, right? That government came to power through a military coup in the midst of a massive world war, and that's not
Well, yes, that is true. They were in the middle of an enormous war where millions of people were dying. I just want to remark again how incredible it is that people think that our government is authoritarian, because we have a whole town called Orania where only white people live, and our government doesn't have a problem with that. They don't have a problem with anything that people do in this country that is not even borderline fascist. It's fascist, and people can do they can do that kind of thing. They can have Orania. They can have a political opinion that is as dissenting as it gets. That is like borderline. What is it when you want to overthrow the government? Treasonous. People can have treasonous opinions and campaigns against our government, and that's allowed, and it's fine, and it's tolerated. And we saw in Parliament the other day a discussion between AfriForum and the EFF, where it was like watching. It was just a fascinating thing to watch, like you know, this sort of parliament having just, they were annoyed with this kind of ridiculous opinion from this like extreme far right dissenting group, but they heard them out. Like, this has been the process throughout the land reform hearings, is that the government will hear everyone's opinion no matter how much they disagree with it, which is one of those things that the right wing pretends to care about. They pretend to care about like diversity of opinion and listening to all sides of an argument and hearing these things out. But I don't actually believe that the right wing in South Africa really believes that. I think they're just saying that because they want their side heard, and they know that their side is not appealing to most people. And the fact that the ANC and the government itself and Parliament is so incredibly democratic and painstakingly goes through these democratic processes in an orderly way to hear everyone's opinion. I mean, I don't know what could be further from authoritarianism than that, you know?
Yeah.
Like, I just find it blows my mind. But I think maybe we should wrap it up there for this evening.
Okay.
Yeah, like, I'll let you get back to your afternoon since it's afternoon over there.
Yeah, if I could just say one more thing, and to that point you raised, it's in fact, not only is South Africa not at all autocratic, but anytime the state, I mean, Zuma's administration, I mean, it was corrupt absolutely. One of the reasons he had his downfall took place is because of this clash between his presidency and the National Treasury, which was reported in outlets such as the Wall Street Journal and The Economist, not at all left-wing publications. But essentially, in order to hold on to power, he was trying to increase fiscal expansion and cash transfer programs, to what he considered to be the base, his electoral base, and it is partially a large base of the ANC, impoverished Black South Africans who rely on these transfer payments and social grants, and he wanted to actually increase spending and increase fiscal expansion to try to start appealing more to this base as opposed to companies and corporations, and he was thwarted in those attempts by the National Treasury, and because of the absence of this economic planning ministry, even when a government really tries, it seems, to implement policies, even for selfish reasons, which tend to be a little more progressive in terms of fiscal expansion and to try to limit fiscal austerity, the Treasury was able to, lobby and prevent that from happening, and eventually have him deposed. So, it's clearly there's not much danger of South Africa moving towards any kind of an autocratic.
I would say that if anything, we've been in danger, and we are in danger of going the other direction. Like, I don't know how much further we can be captured by a private enterprise, but like every indicator seems to point in that direction. We try and do the most piecemeal land reform ever, and the opposition that South Africa has met with was absolutely staggering. Like,
Right.
But yeah, what I do want to ask you is that I think it might be valuable for us to maybe revisit these topics again in another video later on.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Break them down a little bit more. So really go into the definitions and really go into the reasons why certain things work and other things don't. So yeah, I mean, thank you so much for coming on my humble YouTube channel. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I hope you'll have me back. It'll be great.
No. Yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to talk about these. I'd love to talk about these things more and go a little bit more in depth with each one of these things that we've discussed. And absolutely.
I'd love to. That'd be great.
It's really valuable for me to have someone like you on who really understands these things and can expound on them. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, keep up. I hope you keep doing this. I know you get a lot of flack from sometimes, but yeah, I hope you.
Funny. Yeah, I do. I'm crazy, and you know what, Shaukat, you're crazy. You're deranged. Like
Yeah.
that is what I'm gonna tell. That's what I have to bring to the table, is that you're a deranged communist. But thanks for coming on anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay, cool. Have a good one. Thanks, Shaukat.
You too. Bye bye.